Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Economic Forces Podcast. I'm Brian Albrecht of Kennesaw State, and I'm joined, as always, by Josh Henderson, who's at Ole Miss. This podcast is meant to supplement our weekly newsletter, which you can find at pricetheory.substack.com. Who's with us today, Josh?
Today's guest is David Glasner. Many of you know him from his blog, Uneasy Money. He's also the author of Free Banking and Monetary Reform, and a forthcoming book called Studies in the History of Monetary Theory. And so we want to kind of talk to David today a little bit about his background at UCLA and also kind of the intersection of price theory and his own work. So maybe to get started, maybe you could just tell us, how did you end up at UCLA?
It's not that complicated, actually. I grew up in Los Angeles. And my older brother, went to UCLA. He turned out to be a mathematician. So I just sort of followed along. When I got to UCLA, I was not sure where I was headed. My initial major was poli-sci, and I took a poli-sci class with the UCLA may still be. In those days, it was on the quarter system. I wasn't too impressed with the poli-sci class that I took, and then I took Econ 1 my second quarter, and I thought that was a lot more interesting. The assigned textbook then was the first edition of Al Shinnon-Allen's University Economics, and that got me really interested. So I switched majors, and it was all UCLA after that. So I graduated. It was actually in 1970 with my BA, and then I continued on to grad school. My relationship to UCLA is pretty deep and long-standing.
So you come into grad school. Did you know kind of what you wanted to do, or what was that initial period like, even for someone steeped within UCLA tradition?
Yeah, actually, when just to go back and reminisce a little bit more, I took the two intro courses, introductory micro and introductory macro, in my freshman year. And then I was all excited about doing economics. I was starting to read more economic stuff on my own. When I got to my sophomore year, I had to start taking some math, which I hadn't done before, and then I also took the intermediate theory sequence. So it was a three-quarter sequence for micro, general equilibrium, and macro. And my general equilibrium, which was a pretty non-technical, or relatively non-technical, non-mathematical treatment, was by Axel Leyenhofer. And then I had Axel as my prof for macro. So I became pretty close, not real close, but I got to know Axel quite well. And his famous book on Keynesian economics and the economics of Keynes was just coming out at that time. So I developed early on an interest in macro, and also one of the interesting things about Leeuwenhoek was the extent to which he was applying ideas that he had picked up from Armin Alshin about search, and trying to use those ideas to explain what Keynes had been doing, and that approach to macro is one that has stayed with me, for the subsequent half century since I was in Axel's class. He actually taught another undergraduate class, which I took, which was called macrodynamics. So I had a pretty strong basis in the relationship between price theory or microeconomics and macroeconomics from that early exposure to Axel Leeuwenhoek. And one of the other undergraduate professors that I had at that time, who was very influential in how my thinking developed, was Ben Klein. Ben Klein was a newly minted PhD from Chicago, and he was teaching. He had two specialties in those days. First was industrial organization, which is what he stayed with for most of his career. But early on, his first papers in his dissertation at Chicago was on the competitive supply of money. So again, there was that exposure through Ben Klein to the idea that the money supply is not a mechanical product of a monetary base and a money multiplier. There's actually an economic price theoretical analysis that explains how the money supply is competitively determined. So that again was a very formative experience for me that influenced my thinking. I also took Ben for industrial organization, so that sort of put me on the direction of staying at UCLA and doing graduate work there. Although I guess at that stage of my development, I was still into Milton Friedman a lot, and I was thinking of applying to grad school at Chicago. In the end, for personal reasons, I was accepted at Chicago, but for personal reasons, I decided to stay at UCLA, and I very much, I'm very glad that that's the direction I chose rather than having gone to Chicago. Friedman was very popular, obviously, at UCLA, but there were certain dissonances that I picked up. First, from Klein, who actually was Milton's student, and he wrote his dissertation under Friedman. And I never actually asked Ben how that worked, because a lot of what he was saying was not exactly Friedmanite. And Friedman, if you read the book by Perry Marilling, he wrote a wonderful biography of Fisher Black. There was some serious fireworks going on at the Money Workshop at Chicago when Fisher Black started giving his anti-quantity theory musings to the Money Workshop. But I never actually went into it with Ben about to ask him to explain how that relationship worked out. He eventually sort of moved on from monetary theory to concentrating on industrial organization. Most of his publications have been in the industrial organization area. But his early work on the competitive supply of money was really very important.
So when I think of you, I think of macro, I think of monetary economics, but your advisor was Demsetz, is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. So
Harold
how
was
did
my
that
advisor, but my dissertation was it was a straight IO dissertation. So I also had that sort of dual interest in both industrial organization and monetary theory. When I got to the dissertation stage, I was sort of floundering around for a year or so, trying to come up with the topic. And the topic that I was interested in writing about was on price stickiness, which was then and still remains sort of a hot topic. And I tried coming up with a topic, but I didn't have a clear theory, and I was just sort of searching for something to write about, and I never came up with anything. So I never came up with anything that was like beyond sort of stating issues. And I think my understanding at that stage really wasn't up to the task. If I knew then what I know now, I might have been able to write something interesting. But at that stage of my development, it was a bridge too far for me. So I then sort of retreated and regrouped, and I went for an IO topic on the regulation of automobile insurance premiums, which was a good topic, but I never really warmed to the topic, and it was just sort of an exercise for me. Later on in my graduate work, I started to get close to Earl Thompson, and then his ideas became very important for me. But I was already in the process of writing that dissertation, and it didn't seem practical for me to give up a work in hand to then write something for Earl. So I've had this over my career, this ebb and flow between monetary topics and IO topics. Actually, in the early 2000s, when we were in the period of the Great Moderation, I started to think that I was going to do more research in the area of intellectual property. I had some research started, but then came, luckily, one might say, luckily the financial crisis came, and that sort of reawakened a strong interest in monetary questions. So I picked up work that I had sort of left on the shelf and began really thinking more about it. And I guess there is something to be said for the old who was it the it's the Bombarkian theory of roundabout production and the productivity of time. So if you leave something on the shelf, it doesn't always deteriorate. Sometimes it actually improves, and so in that respect, I think some of my work actually that I've written recently, which started a long time ago, is actually a lot better now than it would have been if I had sort of pushed through and gotten published early on. So things that have a way of working out sometimes for the best.
Yeah, one thing that it's interesting, this back and forth that you're talking about between these two pretty different fields, right? IO and macro, monetary especially. I mean, very few grad students today are those their fields, right? They're going to be kind of macro centric or micro IO centric. But our newsletter, and we talk about, we say price theory all the time. It's all about price theory. But we've had, most of them written by Josh, we've had 6-7 posts that are really monetary economics. And I think it's such a crucial connection there that, the ideas of search is one manifestation, but other ideas that seems lost kind of for most people when we start talking about macro and money.
Right. I think there's some very deep ideas in monetary theory and macroeconomics in general that really have deep roots in price theory. Just to give you one example, in Ben Klein's original article, Competitive Supply of Money, that was 1974 in the Journal of Money, Credit, and Banking. That was drawn from his dissertation. So he suggested the idea that competitive banks could supply money, and where the point on which he differed with Friedman was Friedman had written as early as like 1951. I was just looking at it to get the reference in his paper on commodity reserve currencies. It was published in the Journal of Political Economy, and it was reprinted in his collection on essays in positive economics. And in that paper, he explicitly said competition and the supply of money is self-destructive, because a money producer is going to have an incentive to keep producing until the price is equal to marginal cost. So the marginal cost of creating money is close to zero. So competition results in hyperinflation. So Klein said, well, that argument doesn't work because their competition doesn't have to be manifested in driving down the value of money, because you supply money at lower cost. Competition is going to operate by banks paying interest to their deposit holders to hold money. So you can't just argue that competition is going to drive down the value of money. You have to look at other ways in which competition can work. And the other point, of course, that Klein made was the argument that competition is going to drive down the value of money depends on the assumption that monies are indistinguishable. So you're going to depreciate your money only if you think that nobody or competition will encourage you to issue money and drive the value of your money down, only if your money is indistinguishable from anybody else. So that's the idea that money production is counterfeiting. But that's only true if monies are not indistinguishable. Money, if nobody can print money with your brand name on it, except you're not going to overproduce money. You're not going to create this an excess supply of money. What you'll do is pay higher interest to depositors or find some other way of making the money more attractive to hold. Just to close the loop here, Klein was not clear in explaining exactly the nature of the contract that would enable money producers to guarantee to their customers that they wouldn't depreciate the value of their money. Ronald Coase in 1972 wrote a paper called Durability and Monopoly. And what he said in that paper was, you can't assume that a monopolist will be able to raise the price of a good that he produces if that good is durable. Because a durable good can be sold at a higher than competitive price only if the initial purchasers of the good can be assured that the value is not going to depreciate it after they buy the good. So if I can sell this widget, I can produce this widget for $5, but I want to sell it for 10. How am I going to get somebody to pay 10 for me, $10 if the buyer knows that it can be reproduced for $5? So Coase's answer was, well, there are two ways. One, you can rent it, or two, you can offer to buy it back at the initial price. This is one of my few actual personal anecdotes with Alshin. In 1972, approximately, Alshin was giving a seminar on to grad students, which I was in which he would just talk about, what he read in the newspaper that morning, and he would say, "Well, how are you going to analyze this problem?" I can't think of an example right now, but that's what the whole course was. It was a wonderful seminar because you got to hear how Alshin thought about things and how he would set up a problem and how he would force you to think it through. So after the seminar, I was puzzling about this, and I said to him, well, Klein has this paper, he of course knew about the paper, it hadn't been published yet, where he says that money producers can produce this good, which is has zero cost of production or close to zero cost of production. And he says that money producers can maintain a positive value for that good, even though it's costless to produce. So how does that square with the Coase article? So he said, yeah, what they have to do is have a repurchase clause, which means that they have to be willing to buy it back. Of course, when they buy it back, they have to buy it back in terms of something else that has a value. So that's a convertibility requirement. So the sort of addendum to Klein is, which actually Klein discusses, but it's not so obvious, about the difference between a dominant money and a non-dominant money. So if you're issuing money and you don't have the dominant money, you have to make it convertible into the dominant money or into some outside asset. And that's the way that you have to can maintain a money producer can maintain a value of money that's greater than the cost of producing that money. Anyway, so that's just to confirm your very astute observation that that there is a deep connection between a lot of monetary theory topics and price theory. Of course, that's coming into view now because of there's a lot of nonsense. Not all of it's nonsense, but there is a lot of nonsense about cryptocurrencies that sort of misses a lot of these very basic concepts, price theoretic concepts.
That's really interesting. I hadn't thought about COS in that line of work, but it makes sense. I mean, it comes up with this idea. Let me circle it back a little bit. You know, in the Marshallian framework, to kind of get a little bit ahead of ourselves, we often think of just price as being the thing that drives everything. And so it's interesting that Friedman is coming from thinking about price, what's happening just to the price. Where the UCLA school, Klein, a lot of this, think of quality assurance. There's lots of competition that's not about price. You see that in the textbook as well. It's just an interesting divide that, for me, this conversation and things I've been talking about in the last few months, it's really, I don't know if it's the best way to divide Chicago and UCLA, but it's something that definitely helps me to kind of make them not just price theory the same in both camps.
Right. I think just to put Coase back in the picture, Coase was certainly not a Chicago economist. He wound up in Chicago in 1959, 1960, but he was already fully formed as an economist, and his roots were at the London School of Economics, and then he came to the University of Virginia. So this is not to, I don't want to overemphasize the distinction between Chicago and UCLA. There are some distinctions, and Harold Demsetz himself was at both, spent a lot of time at both places and did wonderful work at both places. But I think the UCLA approach was a lot more foundational, that they wanted to get more deeply into underlying concepts. And sometimes I think about it in terms, describe it in terms of Friedman's paper on the methodology of positive economics. And what he says there, well, assumptions don't matter. All that matters is do you get testable implications, and are the implications borne out by the evidence, which is kind of an easy way out, I think. What you have to do, at least this is what I take out of my UCLA experience, is you have to look at more than just the standard assumptions. You have to see what do different assumptions, what are the implications of different assumptions. So it's not enough to say, well, I assume perfect competition, and if the if perfect competition allows me to draw certain conclusions, and those conclusions are borne out, then okay, everything is fine. But if you read Alshin and Allen carefully, you'll see that they repeatedly talk about, well, what happens if the assumption of perfect knowledge that is a standard assumption of the perfect competition model. What happens if you assume that people don't have perfect knowledge? You have to assume that people are searching. You have to assume that people are holding inventories. You have to assume that people are advertising. So there are all these implications that you can tease out of changing the assumptions of the standard model. So it's not enough to just say, I'm fine with the standard model. You have to try to look more deeply into the implications of changing different assumptions. So when people talk about neoclassical economics, they have a very limited model that they associate with the neoclassical economics. But neoclassical economics is a method of doing analysis that is applicable under a whole range of different assumptions. And you can't just say, well, these are my assumptions, and that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. You have to be willing to look at what happens when you, which is not always so easy, but you have to really think hard about what changes when the conventional assumptions are not are altered in some way. And I think that's what really sets the UCLA approach, or the old UCLA approach, what sets it apart from different other schools within the larger neoclassical universe.
So I think this point about that Coase made, I think I first encountered this idea in Thompson, right? So when Thompson wrote his paper about how do we get money into an Arrow-Dubrow model, right? He sort of makes this argument, and then he kind of takes this argument and then develops that into a whole set of implications that matter at kind of the macro level. And so for me, one of the reasons why I was interested in economics was because I was interested in a lot of the monetary stuff. I found it, when I sort of discovered Friedman and Schwartz, this was kind of this moment for me where I realized there's this whole set of arguments that you don't even know exist, right? Because this was not the kind of conventional explanation of, for example, the Great Depression or something that you get in high school or something. And so you start thinking about this and you start thinking, well, wait a second, I need to learn more about money. And so then when I was in graduate school, I was really interested in this monetary stuff. And then we start going through these models, and we're talking about monetary policy, but there's no money or anything in the model. We're just moving interest rates around and these sorts of things. And so I found this really kind of bizarre. And so for me, one of the things I started doing was I started trying to go back and read all of these people who were trying to get money into their models, because I kind of thought, well, maybe there's a sort of lesson here. And everybody had these sort of tricks. But for me, I guess when I read Thompson, this really helped me to kind of think through this thing, because I just kind of felt like he had a more kind of compelling argument about what's going on here and how we can think about money in the context of like a normal sort of general equilibrium framework or something like that. And it was sort of much more useful to my thinking in terms of, how this whole system worked and sort of what's going on here. And so I know that this was also very influential on you because I've read your work, and so you build on these ideas, right? And so I want to talk about those ideas, but before maybe we talk about those ideas, maybe you can talk a little bit about Earl, and then you can kind of segue into how you started developing some of his ideas.
Yeah. Earl Thompson was a unique guy. He was very quirky in a lot of different ways, and when I was an undergraduate, he actually was technically my undergraduate advisor, but as an econ major, so I had occasional contact with him, but I didn't take any classes from him. And people graduate students. I didn't know that many graduate students as an undergrad. But he had this reputation for at least being eccentric. So I can't say that I stayed away from him, but I was not, I just didn't feel any natural attraction to him, given the other people that I was associating with. He also, one of the kind of red flags, I wouldn't really call it a red flag, but sort of one of the warning signals about him was that he already in his early paper, the 1974 paper, The Theory of Money and Value Consistent with Theory of Money Consistent with Orthodox Value Theory, which is a wonderful paper. And there's so much to learn from in that paper. It's a classic paper. Is a paper that you have to go back and reread many times before you get everything that you can possibly get from it. And that's a paper that I now can say I think I fully understand after all these years. So one of the warning flags in that paper was that he came out and said the currency school, referring to the famous debates of the mid-19th century between the currency school and the banking school. Currency school were all wrong, and the banking school had it right, which was a kind of an unconventional, at least in those days, was an unconventional view. Certainly the Chicago economists were all very strongly currency school people. Hayek and Mises were all currency school people. And the banking school was regarded as these, if not quite monetary cranks, they were like looked at with a certain skepticism, to say the least. What changed my view about Earl was when I took his. I didn't take his graduate monetary theory class for credit. I had already taken Axel Leyenhoepen's credit in my first year, but in preparing for the theory preliminary exams, I wanted to take Thompson's class to get better prepared. And that that experience of going through a whole quarter of 3-hour seminars once a week with Earl, basically going through his that 1974 paper, which was still not yet published, and then the first early draft of the still unpublished 1977 working paper on reformulation of macro theory. Those plus other stuff that he discussed, but it was basically those two papers that formed the essence of the course. And it just turned my way of thinking around very radically. It also fit in, although I didn't immediately see it, it also fit in with a lot of what Ben Klein had been doing. And they had sort of independently come to the same conclusions about the viability of a private money supply, a competitive money supply that wouldn't lead to hyperinflation. So that experience of taking Earl Thompson's class and hearing him, he was a better expositor in oral expositor than as a written expositor. I found reading the papers a lot more difficult because he didn't fully explain. You have to do a lot of work to really understand what his arguments. When in this informal setting and you hear him talk it through, then it all became clear. So that exposure to Earl in the classroom is what really made me appreciate the quality and the depth of his ideas. Of course, I still think that he would latch onto an idea, and once he was convinced that he was right, he just went with it. And then there's a certain lack of nuance in his arguments sometimes. Once he's convinced that a certain argument is right, he'll take it all the way to the limit. And other arguments that might be sort of counter it will not be fully incorporated into the analysis. Well, we could go on for a whole hour just talking about Earl, but just to, for me, there's a lot of his work that I appreciate, but it's really his work on monetary theory and also the importance, which he emphasized a lot, the importance of the Hicksian temporary equilibrium approach that have really shaped my own the development of my own thinking about economics and monetary economics.
So I think one of the things that when I think of your work, like in free banking and monetary reform, and I think of Thompson's work, to me, the idea that price theory and monetary theory are these two separate things are that, that would not be evident from reading your work or Thompson's work, because I think a lot of what a lot of the implications, a lot of the lessons that you get are drawn from, just thinking about things in the same way that we would think about any other good. Like so many times money is just treated like this is like this completely different thing. And so we have to think about it completely differently. And I think a lot of what's going on in your work and his work is actually just saying, well, wait a minute, we know this stuff from price theory, so let's actually just apply that to money and let's see how far we can sort of take that and what kind of implications did I get. Do you think that that's a fair characterization?
Right. I think that's spot on. I would, though, like to make a certain distinction or a qualification to that, because I want to distinguish the UCLA approach or the Thompson approach to using price theory and macro from the Microfoundations approach that or ideology that has come to dominate a lot of modern macroeconomics. And back in the 70s, when I was at UCLA, Microfoundations was really something important, and people were thinking about it. And my early failed attempts to try to come up with some account of price stickiness or price rigidity were motivated by that. But that is a different. That's a different way of thinking from what has become from Microfoundations as they are now understood. Because Microfoundations as they are now understood is simply a way of avoiding complexity in an economic analysis. So it's good to have some first principles that guide your thinking about how to do monetary analysis and seeing whether your monetary analysis or your macro analysis is consistent with what we know about price theory. But that doesn't mean that you can reduce all of macroeconomics or monetary theory to an optimization exercise, or a dynamic optimization exercise. And I think modern macroeconomics has gone off the rails in that way. At least that's the position I've sort of come to in trying to follow what modern macro has become. So all the complexity of a modern economy and all the different issues in coordinating millions of independent agents who are trying to optimize but can't optimize because the condition for them to be able to optimize is that everybody else is doing exactly what they need to do. But there's nothing that ensures that they're all doing what they need to do. So for optimization, individual optimization to be consistent. So that's a real intellectual problem. And macroeconomics, as it's now practiced, is simply said, well, general equilibrium theory tells us that that we can prove the existence of an equilibrium. Therefore, our job is done, and we just have to reduce. We can reduce macroeconomics to the optimization exercise for a representative individual. And I think that's just a travesty. So there's a right way to do price theory, and there's a wrong way to do price theory. And I think modern macroeconomics has taken the wrong road. And that's my sermon for today.
I think that's a really natural spot to bring in some of your other work in the newest book coming out, which should be out right around the time that this podcast airs. One thing when I read you as one way that you present your theories that I find very attractive for me as a learner and trying to understand this is you contrast it with a lot of competing theories, okay? And really go through deep into the intellectual history, the history of thought. But history of thought, not in and of itself, but history of thought to help us refine our current theories for current policy or policy matters, to take something that a lot of macro people have looked at, but you, especially the Great Depression. What do all these different theories, how do they help us understand practical real world things? And I really appreciate that balance between history of thought and policy relevant discussions. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit, bringing up other ideas within other schools of thought, if that's the term we're going to use, although that might not be the right word. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about Ralph Hawtrey, I think is how you say it. I've only read it on your blog, really. So that's who he was, how his ideas influence you, and then how you see that as at a general level, how that stands in contrast to ideas at the time, but also what you see within macro today.
Okay, so that's a very good question, because it's interesting how I came across Hawtrey. Hawtrey was just a name that came up frequently in my early readings, but really not somebody that was paid much attention to anymore when I was in graduate school, and I assume that he hasn't. My efforts, to the contrary notwithstanding, hasn't changed that too much. That he's not widely read anymore by young economists. Certainly not assigned very frequently. So one of the aspects of Earl Thompson's grad course in macro was he went through his theory of the Great Depression. It's the theory that I've discussed in my book, pretty much. Namely that the gold standard collapsed in World War I, and there was an inflation as gold was demonetized. And after the war, there was an attempt to reconstruct the gold standard. But as countries rejoined the gold standard, they were remonetizing gold, and the increase in the demand for gold was deflationary. When prices are set in terms of gold and the demand for gold increases, that means that nominal prices quoted in terms of gold were going to fall, and that's what caused serious deflation and the Great Depression. That's a very brief summary of the basic theory. So when I wrote my book, Banking and Monetary Reform, and I already had that theory as the Great Depression. I wanted to explain it. What I discovered was, basically through references by Harry Johnson and Jacob Frenkel in their discussion of the monetary approach to the balance of payments, they cited Hawtrey a lot. So that got me to actually look at Hawtrey and his book. I think the first book that I looked was his book on the gold standard. And in that book on the gold standard, he laid out in detail exactly that sequence that Earl Thompson had described. I'm uh, uh, I have no doubt that Earl Thompson came up with this theory just on his own without having read Hawtrey. But to me, when I saw it already laid out by Hawtrey, uh, that was pretty astonishing to me because I'd never heard of it. Nobody had ever talked about it. So it was like it had just gone down a memory hole. And it's such a powerful theory. And Milton Friedman had done all this work on resurrecting a monetary theory of the Great Depression, and he doesn't mention Hawtrey at all in the monetary history, and hardly ever mentions him in any other of his writings. So that got me increasingly interested in the work of Ralph Hawtrey. And what I found was that in many respects, his analysis of how banks create money and that money creation by banks is a form of credit creation. And that's how he looked at it, which is exactly the way Thompson describes it in more abstract terms. There was this really interesting overlap between ideas that I already acquired from Thompson, and I found them had been anticipated by Hawtrey. And Hawtrey's work is in many ways, sometimes he's difficult to understand, but he's usually very logical, very concise, very powerful in his exposition. And I felt that it was really a loss for the economics profession that his work sort of fell out of currency, so to speak, over the years in the economics profession. So I've tried to do a little bit with my blog and my other writings to revive interest in Hawtrey, as well as his older Swedish contemporary, Gustav Cassel, whose work is also not as widely appreciated as it should be, who had essentially the same theory of the Great Depression as Hawtrey did.
So now I kind of feel bad because when I teach about the Great Depression, I always talk about, the two different monetary theories. And so, because I think most people think there's like a monetary theory of the Great Depression, which is Friedman and Schwartz, right? And so I always kind of contrast that, but I always call it the Thompson, Glasner, Sumner theory. So maybe I need to add two more names to the...
Scott was an early advocate of that theory of the Great Depression, and he wrote a fine book about it, Midas Paradox, and he was kind enough to give me a little bit of credit for his approach to NGDP targeting. He deserves whatever credit he gets.
Oh, I was thinking maybe just to near the end here to kind of change directions a little bit. Josh opened up saying that most people would know you from your blog. I wonder if you could talk just a second about the origin of that and kind of what you see. I mean, you continue to write deep, very interesting. I'm obsessed with different ideas of equilibrium as a theorist, and you write deep, long blog posts on that still to this day. Why do you, how to get started, and why do you continue to kind of put out these blog posts, what is the value that it's doing for you?
Okay, thanks for that question. The blog it actually was inspired by Scott Sumner. When he came out with his blog, he did mention me and Earl Thompson as sort of as early advocates of some form of NGDP targeting, specifically the concluding chapter of my book on free banking and monetary reform, where I went through in detail Thompson's proposal for what he called a labor standard, which was aimed at stabilizing the average or the expectation of the average wage level. And he, that is Scott, cited that as an early example of the approach he was taking, whereby the Fed would aim to stabilize the expected increase in nominal GDP in the level of nominal GDP. And that his argument was if that expectation was stabilized, that in other words, that the public was consistently expecting 5% increase in nominal GDP, I want to phrase this correctly, that they would expect that NGDP would converge on a path of 5% increase in nominal gross domestic product over time, that would ensure as much stability in the overall macroeconomy as was possible. At any rate, I actually started to do some research. This was after the financial crisis of 2008, and I started to do a little bit of research showing that that the stock market, which is an indicator of what the markets are expecting to happen to the macroeconomy, among other things, was closely correlated with changes in the stock prices. The S&P 500 were closely correlated with changes in expected inflation after not only after, but in the run-up to and the financial crisis, the crash in 2008, and subsequently. In other words, when the public expected falling inflation, the market was going down, and when they expected rising inflation, the market was increasing. Those changes were correlated. And that was an important result. And I didn't publish it, but I posted it on SSRN, and Scott talked about it, and Paul Krugman talked about it. He's saying that excessive concern about inflation was bad for the economy. Excessive concern by the monetary authorities had been responsible for a lot of economic disturbances before and after the financial crisis. So then the success of Scott's blog kind of encouraged me to think about starting my own blog, and I was concerned. This was like in 2011 that the fear mongering about inflation at that time, even as the economy was barely on a very not a very rapid recovery from the Great Recession, that fear mongering about inflation, largely from very conservative economists and economic commentators, like the Wall Street Journal editorial page, was hindering the recovery. And I started writing a lot in that vein and criticizing a lot of the commentary that was inflation phobia. And I like to cite the remark of Hawtrey in one of his books that warnings of inflation during the Great Depression, which were actually quite common, was like crying "fire, fire" in Noah's flood. So I dedicated my blog to Hawtrey, and the line is "Commentary on Monetary Policy in the Spirit of Ralph Hawtrey." And if you go to the blog, easymoney.com, you'll see a bunch of iterations of Ralph Hawtrey in his old age, on the border of the blog. At any rate, I may have increased Hawtrey's visibility to the economics community slightly as a result. But I was very active for a couple of years on the blog, and my rate of posting has gradually diminished. So lately, I'm not posting that frequently, but I have posted. My two most recent posts are kind of thought pieces about a paper that I am supposed to be writing for a conference coming up at the end of November, commemorating the 150th anniversary of the publication of Carl Menger's, the English title is Principles of Economics. There's a German title, which I won't try to say now. But it was published in 1871, and about the same time that Jevons wrote his great work, and while just a couple of years before, while Ross wrote his work, the three almost simultaneous works ushering in what's called the marginal revolution, the marginal utility theory of value. And in that paper, what I'm trying to do, the paper which I'm trying to write, and which I posted a couple of blog posts recently, the two most recent posts are in what I call the Marshall-Walras divide in economics. And although Jevons was the one who was one who wrote in 1871 his book on marginal utility theory, Marshall was already thinking along the same lines, and Jevons died at a young age, and it was Marshall's work, which was published a couple of decades later, The Principles of Economics, which sort of defined for the English-speaking world what neoclassical economics became. So what I'm trying to do there is to suggest in these blog posts, even though I haven't mentioned Menger yet in the post, that's going to be in a forthcoming post. I'm trying to suggest that Menger provides like a third way between or around the Marshall-Walras approach. Marshall is usually held up as the price theory guy who does the analysis market by market in terms of supply and demand, or what's called partial equilibrium analysis. That's bread and butter price theory. You look at each market, you try to analyze what the supply conditions are, what the demand conditions are, then there's a price that equilibrates the market. Walras said analysis looks at price determination simultaneously in all markets. And for markets to be in equilibrium, for one market to be in equilibrium, all markets have to be in equilibrium. And so that's the tension between how general equilibrium analysis and partial equilibrium analysis. It's not, at least I'm not capable of boiling it down to a couple of sentences for now, but I think that tension between whether the correct approach is to do it market by market or all markets simultaneously is a real difficult problem that economists are still struggling with. And the Chicago School is very much Marshallian. The trend in pure theory has been towards general equilibrium. And I don't think either approach is satisfactory. And I'm still struggling with how to get around that divide. Just take a minute to say what the problem is. The problem with partial equilibrium analysis is that it presumes that there's a general equilibrium in all the other markets. And it's only on the assumption of general equilibrium in every other market that you can do the partial equilibrium analysis. So I sometimes refer to it as they're not only micro foundations for macroeconomics, they're macro foundations for microeconomics. Because and so there are these limitations in supply demand theory and price theory that have to be recognized, that sometimes we pretend aren't there, but we really can't always pretend that they're not there. A lot of applied economic theory is okay because you can make these assumptions, these ceteris paribus assumptions, and you can do reasonable work, empirical work, applied work on that basis. But you can't forget about what the limitations are. And that's always the necessity, is not to forget, in doing good economics, don't forget what your assumptions are and what the problems are with those assumptions. So that's the message that I'm now trying to get across to my readers. I hope hope it'll become clearer as I work the ideas down.
That circles back nicely to the earlier point you made about, part of the UCLA approach. Demsetz, I think of especially as the digging into the assumptions and not just taking the positivist Friedman approach. I think this is a pretty good spot to wrap up. I encourage all of our listeners to check out David's blog, uneasymoney.com, for lots on Hawtrey, lots on financial, monetary economics, lots on understanding equilibrium. And the new book is called Studies in the History of Monetary Theory, Controversies and Clarifications. So thanks for being on Economic Forces Podcast, David.
Thanks for having me.